Hello and welcome everyone. In this video, we are going to learn about the 4 quick checkmating patterns that you can do in the bishop's opening. The bishop's opening happens after the move e4, black responds with e5 and we play our bishop to c4. Although it's a slightly unusual move because common moves are to play the knight to f3 or knight to c3, but bishop c4 makes a lot of sense as it is developing a piece and is targeting the f7 weakness, so that you can get an early attack on the black king in the early stage of the game. This is what you are going to learn in this game. I will be showing you 4 games in which white exploited the weakness on the f7 square and gave a checkmate to the black king very early in the game. So let's get started. After bishop c4, there are multiple choices which black can respond with. The best is to play the knight to f6. In the last video, we have seen what happens after he plays his bishop to c5 and knight to c6. If in case you have missed our last video, then you can go and check out the link in the description box. So in this game, this is the first game. In this game, white played his knight to f6. After knight f6, we can go aggressively with a very sharp pawn to d4. After pawn d4, that's a free pawn and he can capture it. We don't recapture it immediately with the queen because we don't want to give a free tempo to our opponent, because after queen captures on d4 square, he can play his knight to c6 and will have to move the queen. Instead, there are 2 choices that we can do. Either in this game, white played his pawn to e5, attacking the knight. Now knight has no good squares to go to. If the knight comes on the e4 square, then bishop d5 traps the knight. So he has to only go back on the g8 square. But black player tried to act a little smart here. He first tried to pin the pawn to the king, playing the queen to e7. But white also renewed the threat by playing his queen to e2. Now there's no more a pin, so the knight has to go back. Time knight went back. Now you can play your knight to f3, attacking the d4 pawn. The black player defended it by playing his pawn to c5. And now you can simply castle. After knight c6, you can give an attack to the queen. Play your bishop to g5. The queen has no good squares to go to. The only option here he has is to block the attack with the pawn. So after pawn f6, now we can capture the pawn on the f6 square with our pawn, giving away the queen. So he captures your queen. You can anytime recapture it with your bishop. But more interesting is to follow the forcing moves. What are our 3 forcing moves? Check, cap, t. So here, just go for pawn to f7. And that is not a forcing move. It is actually a checkmate. So see, even though you have asked him to exchange the queens, instead of going for an immediate exchange or immediate capturing of the queen, you should try to look at the forcing moves first. Play the pawn to f7 and that's a beautiful checkmate in this game. So this was game number 1. Now let's have a look at game number 2. So after the bishop's opening, knight f6, pawn d4, he captures your pawn on the d4 square. Now in the last game that we saw was he played his pawn to e5, attacking the knight. In the game number 2, this is a gambit style game. We are not looking for an immediate advantage. Here we are just playing a knight to f3, going slow. Black tried to go aggressively, doing the forcing move, played the bishop to b4, gave you a check. Since the game is the gambit style, white player decided to give the pawn on the c3 square. He pushed his pawn to c3. After black recaptures it, now you cannot recapture it or you don't want to recapture it. So white player went for castling. Black player also decided to put his king into safety and castle. Here you can play your pawn to e5, attack the knight. The knight goes on the e4 square trying to defend the pawn on c3. So first we give an attack to the knight and play your bishop to d5. The knight has to save himself, so he went on the c5 square. Now we are capturing the pawn on c3 and that also gives an attack to the bishop. So the bishop has to go back. The time bishop goes back on the a5 square, now we can play our knight to g5, aggressively trying to give an attack. Now one thing white player might have noticed here, that all the pieces for black are on the queen side. And that's when he decided to take advantage, go for a decisive attack for a checkmate on the h7 square, attacking the king side. So he went for knight to g5. Now here black played his knight to e6, trying to capture this knight. Doesn't matter to white, white can still go queen h5, threatening a checkmate on the h7 square. So if black captures the knight on the g5 square with his knight, you can recapture it with the bishop. Now there's no threat happening on the h7 square, but the bishop is attacking the queen. The queen needs to save herself. The queen goes to e8 and now comes a beautiful checkmating pattern. You can just play your bishop to h6. The idea behind bishop h6 is trapping the king, giving no squares, no sides for the king to go. If the pawn captures the bishop on the f6 square, then you can go with the bishop to e4 and this checkmate is inevitable. And if black player sees that and doesn't capture, instead plays his pawn to h6, then you can go with another beautiful tactical idea. Play your queen to g6. Now there's no way that black can stop this checkmate on the g7 square and white is going to win the game eventually. So you see the advantage of playing the bishop very soon in the game. The knight is still on the home square and the game has, the knight on the b1 square is still on the home square and the game has just ended. So that is how you can play aggressively as white in the bishop's opening. This was all about game number 2. So now let's have a look at game number 3. In game number 3, instead of going for d4 aggressively, white went for knight f3. Now here, black is winning the free pawn on the e4 knight, decided to capture on the e4 square. You can play a knight to c3. Here, if he captures on the c3 square, then knight g5 is a very good idea. Black tried to avoid that. Instead, he wanted to go aggressively. He wanted to take the initiative and give an attack to the white pieces. So black went with his knight to f2. Here, king captures the knight. Bishop c5 comes with a check. You can block the check by playing your pawn to d4. His pawn captures it, and now instead of recapturing it, do an intermediate move. As I always say, look for the forcing moves in the game. CCT. Look for checks, captures, threat. So here, instead of capturing the pawn on d4 square with the knight, what black was hoping that after you capture on the d4 square with your knight, then queen f6 is what black has planned. Black was already having 2 pawns for 1 minor piece and now a good attack. The king is distracted, cannot castle, he has moved. So this is what black player was hoping. But instead of doing the usual move, you first do an intermediate move. Play your rook to e1 and give a check. So the king has to go on the f8 square. Now don't capture the pawn on d4 with the same, because black has the same threat of playing the queen to f6. Instead, we can play our knight to e4, attack the bishop. The bishop goes back on the b6 square. Now white player did a move like queen to d3. This is a strange little move, but it also makes sense that the pawn on d4, if it would have moved on the d3 square, then it was a discovered check to the king. So maybe white player is trying to block that, and he has played his queen to d3 so that the pawn cannot be pushed forward. Black underestimated white's plans and played his pawn to d5. Now pawn d5 at first looks good because it is giving a double attack to the bishop as well as to the knight. One of the minor piece is going to lose eventually. So here white decided to give a check first. White played his queen to a3, give a check. The king has to go on the g8 square. Otherwise, knight to f6 was a double check, so queen g8 was forced. And now you can capture the pawn on the d5 square, which also looks okay because you're not sacrificing the bishop actually. There was no choice. Either you were going to lose the knight or you were going to lose the bishop. So he decided to capture the pawn. When the queen captures the bishop on the d5 square, now comes interesting sacrifice, knight to f6. It is a fork. So black is forced to capture the knight with his g pawn and then sacrifice the queen. You can play your queen to f8. If he captures your queen, if he has to capture the queen, then comes bishop h6. The only option black has here is to go on the g8 square, and then there's a beautiful checkmate, rook to e8, a checkmating pattern. So see how you have sacrificed your knight. You have sacrificed your bishop first, then your knight, then the queen, and gave a checkmate with using just a bishop and a rook. This is how you can play in the bishop's opening. Now quickly let's have a look at the 4th game. So here, instead of capturing on the f2 square, let's see what if black captures on the c3 square. If black captures your knight on the c3 square, you are going to recapture it with your pawn. So here, after he plays his pawn to d6, you can simply castle. And he tries to go aggressively by playing his bishop to g4. After he plays his bishop to g4, I want you guys to think here as white. What will be the correct continuation for white and how is white winning this game? Comment down your moves in the chat box and we will be looking at the solution in the next. Till the time, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share with your friends if you like our content. Thank you.